The office was quiet, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. She sat at her desk, carefully organizing papers, her movements precise and quiet. The work was hard, repetitive, and sometimes boring, but it paid the bills. She had learned long ago that keeping her head down and avoiding attention was the safest way to survive here. Her boss was known for being strict, controlling, and quick to judge mistakes. Most people walked on eggshells around him. She had mastered the art of staying invisible. She had arrived early that morning, as usual, trying to avoid any unnecessary interactions. The office smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning products. She glanced at the clock and realized she had a few minutes before her boss would arrive. Quietly, she hummed a little tune to herself, a habit she had developed over the years to calm her nerves. The melody was soft and almost secret, like a small comfort she could keep to herself. Music had always been her escape, a place where no one could touch her or her feelings. Her coworkers were already at their desks, typing or talking in low voices, but she stayed in her own bubble. She liked it that way. Attention had always made her uncomfortable, even when she knew she could do things well. It was easier to be unnoticed. The hum grew a little louder, though she still kept it gentle. It wasn't long before her boss arrived, striding into the office with his usual air of authority. He carried a stack of files, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for anything that might be out of place. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than usual. She felt a shiver run down her spine. "Good morning," he said, his voice firm. She nodded politely, not looking up, trying to avoid giving him any reason to speak more than necessary. But then something unexpected happened. As he walked past her desk, he stopped and raised an eyebrow. "That humming, is that music?" he asked. She froze. The question made her heart race. Music was personal. It wasn't for anyone else to hear. She quickly shook her head. "Oh, no, just thinking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look convinced. "Really? It sounded like you were humming a tune. Can you play an instrument?" She hesitated, unsure how to answer. The truth was that she had played the piano since she was a child. It had been a big part of her life once, before circumstances forced her to give it up. It was private knowledge, something she hadn't shared with anyone at work. "Yes, I can play a little," she admitted cautiously, careful not to sound too confident. Her boss's eyes lit up with interest. "A little, huh? Well, maybe you'll have a chance to show us someday," he said, his tone half teasing, half commanding. She nodded, keeping her expression neutral. She had no idea he would actually follow through on that thought. The day went on as usual. But there was a subtle shift in the air. Her boss seemed more aware of her presence, occasionally glancing in her direction with a small, calculating smile. She tried to ignore it, focusing on her work, but her mind kept drifting back to the piano. She hadn't played in years, not since life had gotten too complicated and survival had become the priority. The memories were both comforting and painful. That evening, the office was quieter than usual. Most of her coworkers had left, leaving only a few stragglers and her. She was finishing up her tasks, tidying her desk, and preparing to leave, when her boss called her into his office. Her stomach dropped. She hadn't expected this. "Close the door," he said, motioning for her to sit. His expression was serious, but there was an unusual gleam in his eyes. "I've been thinking about that little talent you mentioned. We have a gathering next week, a small company event, and I think it would be interesting if you played for everyone." Her heart raced. She wasn't sure if he was joking, but his tone left no room for doubt. This was an order. She tried to remain calm. I haven't played in a long time," she said softly. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that." He leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk on his face. "Ready or not, you'll do it. Consider it an opportunity. Everyone loves a little surprise talent. I expect you to be prepared." She nodded slowly, feeling a knot in her stomach. She wanted to protest, to tell him it wasn't fair, but she knew from experience that arguing would only make things worse. Instead, she left his office quietly, her mind racing. She walked back to her desk, trying to focus on finishing up her work. But every sound and movement felt heavier, more oppressive. She could feel the weight of the expectation pressing down on her, For the rest of the evening, she stayed after hours, her eyes drifting to the corner of the office where the piano sat, covered in a thin layer of dust. It had been years since anyone had touched it. Her fingers itched with a mix of anticipation and fear. The thought of playing in front of everyone made her palms sweat. She remembered the hours she had spent as a child, practicing in her room until her fingers ached, the music filling the air like a living thing. But those days had been private, a sanctuary from the world. Now that sanctuary felt like it was being torn away. She tried to leave the office quickly, but her mind was still stuck on the piano. As she walked out into the quiet street, the winter air biting at her cheeks, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread mixed with something else's strange excitement. A flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be a chance to reclaim a piece of herself she had long forgotten that night. She went home and sat at the edge of her bed, thinking about what lay ahead. She hadn't touched a piano in years, and the thought of performing in front of her boss and coworkers was terrifying. But she also remembered the joy music had once brought her, the way it had made her feel alive and free. She wondered if she could find that feeling again, if she could summon the courage to play despite the fear. Sleep came reluctantly, her mind racing with memories of scales, melodies, and forgotten songs. She dreamed of the piano, of her fingers dancing across the keys. Sometimes clumsy, sometimes fluid, sometimes filled with emotion she hadn't let herself feel in years. When morning arrived, she woke with a sense of unease, but also a determination she hadn't felt in a long time. Today, she thought she would have to face the challenge. The first step toward the unknown had begun, and there was no turning back. At work, the atmosphere felt heavier, as if everyone sensed the tension she carried. Her coworkers whispered quietly among themselves, curious about what was coming. She focused on her tasks, but her hands trembled slightly as she typed, and her heart beat faster than usual. Every sound seemed amplified, every movement noticed. She tried to act normal, to hide the turmoil inside, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. The day passed in a blur of paperwork, emails, and small interruptions. She kept stealing glances at the piano, imagining the moment she would have to sit down and play. She felt the fear building, but also a strange sense of anticipation, like a door opening to a part of herself she had locked away. She couldn't deny that there was a small spark of excitement underneath the anxiety. By the time evening came again, she was exhausted, mentally and emotionally. She stayed a little later, staring at the piano, running through melodies in her mind, imagining how her fingers would move across the keys. She thought about her boss, about the gathering, and about the people who would be watching. She tried to prepare herself for judgment, for disappointment, and even for laughter. She knew she had to be ready for anything, as she finally left the office that night. The city lights glimmered around her, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were entirely consumed by the challenge ahead. She walked home slowly, each step heavy with anticipation. She wondered if she could find the courage to play, if she could survive the humiliation, if she could remember the music that had once been such a big part of her life. She knew one thing for certain: the days ahead would change everything, and there was no going back to the quiet, invisible life she had been living. The next morning felt heavier than usual. She woke up before the alarm, her mind already tangled with thoughts of the piano and the looming performance. The sunlight was pale and weak, slipping through the blinds and casting long stripes across the floor. She lay in bed for a few moments, feeling the weight of her anxiety pressing down. Her stomach churned at the thought of sitting in front of the piano while her boss and colleagues watched. She had always been careful to avoid attention, but now all eyes would be on her, judging every note, every movement, every mistake. At breakfast, she barely touched her food. The toast felt dry, the coffee bitter. Her mind wandered back to when she was younger, 2 days when she would sit at the piano in her room, losing herself in the music. Those days had been her safe space, her private world. No one could enter, and she felt free. But now, that world felt threatened. She wondered how she could take something so personal and make it into a performance that others would see. The thought made her uneasy. Could she trust herself to do it right? Or would she fail in front of everyone? She arrived at the office early, hoping for some quiet time to collect her thoughts. But even in the stillness, her nerves refused to settle. The office smelled of paper and polish, the familiar hum of fluorescent lights echoing in her ears. She glanced at the piano in the corner, still covered with a thin layer of dust. Its presence felt heavier than ever, as if it were silently reminding her of the task ahead. She hesitated for a moment, then walked toward it. She lifted the cover slowly, revealing the worn keys. They were slightly yellowed, but still smooth under her fingers. She touched them lightly, almost reverently, feeling a spark of the old connection she had once had with music. Her heart skipped a beat as memories flooded back the melodies, the rhythms, the feeling of creating something beautiful. She spent the morning pretending to work, but every glance at the piano sent her mind into a whirl of imagination. How would she play in front of everyone? What if she made a mistake? What if they laughed? The thought of humiliation gnawed at her, a bitter companion to her excitement. She tried to push the fear aside, telling herself that she had played for audiences before, even if it had been small and informal. Still, this was different. This was her boss, and this was her career. It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about survival, about proving she could handle pressure without breaking. Her coworkers noticed her tension. A few tried to strike up casual conversation, asking about the weekend or the usual office chatter, but her answers were short, distracted. She barely heard them. Her mind was preoccupied, running through scales and simple melodies in her head, trying to imagine how she could perform without faltering. She wondered if she should practice secretly at home, but the thought of using her tiny living space for a private rehearsal made her feel even more trapped. There was no escaping the pressure. Every moment was a reminder that she couldn't ignore the task ahead. By mid-morning, her boss made an unexpected appearance near her desk. He didn't speak at first, just watched her as she typed, her hands trembling slightly. When he finally addressed her, his voice was calm but firm. "Have you had a chance to think about the performance?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "Yes." "I have," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I think I can do it." He raised an eyebrow, not saying anything for a long moment. Then he smiled faintly. "Good. I want everyone to be surprised. I expect you to be ready." The words felt like a command etched in stone. She nodded, feeling the pressure build. She knew there would be no backing out. The rest of the day passed slowly, each task feeling heavier than the last. She kept stealing glances at the piano, her imagination alternating between confidence and fear. She pictured herself performing flawlessly, then immediately imagined stumbling over the keys and hearing laughter. The uncertainty gnawed at her. During lunch, she walked to a nearby park to clear her head. The cold air stung her cheeks and made her feel alive, if only briefly. She watched children playing and dogs running, their movements free and unself-conscious. For a moment, she envied their simplicity. How easy it must be to exist without fear of judgment. She closed her eyes, imagining the piano again, letting the notes flow in her mind, even if she didn't play them aloud. It was the only way to find some calm. When she returned to the office, the piano seemed to loom larger than before. The afternoon dragged, each tick of the clock a reminder that the performance was getting closer. She tried to focus on her work, but the fear persisted, creeping into every thought. Every little noise felt amplified. The shuffle of papers, the click of a keyboard, the distant chatterall of it felt like it could betray her nervousness. She realized that everyone was watching, even if they didn't mean to, and that made her heart race faster. Later, a coworker approached her desk, a kind smile on her face. "Hey, don't worry," she said softly. "You'll do fine. You've got talent. Just remember why you love it." Her words struck a chord. She had been so focused on fear that she had almost forgotten the joy that music once brought her. She nodded, grateful for the small encouragement, though the anxiety didn't fully disappear. She realized that this performance wasn't just about the office or her boss, it was about reclaiming a part of herself. She had locked away for too long. As the day ended, she stayed behind to practice in the empty office. She sat at the piano, her fingers hovering above the keys, hesitant at first. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to remember the sensation of the notes under her touch. Slowly, she pressed down, producing a soft, hesitant melody. The sound was awkward at first, rusty from disuse, but as she continued, her confidence grew. She remembered the flow of her fingers, the way the music rose and fell, the emotion it carried. The piano no longer felt like a threat. It felt like an old friend, waiting patiently for her return. She practiced for hours, losing track of time. The melodies started to feel natural again, the fear beginning to melt into determination. She knew she wouldn't be perfect, but she also knew that she could survive the performance. The thought of standing before her boss and colleagues was still terrifying, but she felt a small spark of hope. Perhaps this forced challenge could become an opportunity. Perhaps it could remind her of who she really was, not just the employee who kept her head down and followed orders. When she finally left the office, the sun had already set. The city lights flickered on, casting reflections on the wet streets from the earlier rain. She walked home slowly, her mind still filled with music. She felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. For the first time in a long while, she felt a connection to something bigger than her fear. A reminder that she was more than her job, more than the expectations placed upon her. Music was still a part of her, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could rise to the challenge. That night, she barely slept. Her mind kept returning to the piano, imagining the upcoming gathering, the faces of her coworkers, and the way her boss might react. Anxiety and excitement tangled together, keeping her restless. But amid the fear, a quiet determination began to grow. She realized that this was her moment, a chance to face something that had terrified her for years, and to prove first to herself that she was capable, resilient, and brave as dawn approached. She finally closed her eyes for a few hours, feeling the first true sense of anticipation she had experienced in years. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with pressure and scrutiny, but she also knew that she was ready to confront it. The piano was no longer just an object in the corner of the office. It was a gateway to reclaiming her strength, her talent, and a part of herself she had almost forgotten. The day of the gathering arrived, and the office was buzzing with quiet anticipation. She felt a tight knot in her stomach as she walked through the doors, clutching her bag a little too tightly. The piano sat in the corner of the room, waiting for her, like an old companion she hadn't seen in years. Her heart pounded with each step toward it. She could hear her coworkers talking softly, their curiosity palpable. Some whispered guesses about what she would play. Others exchanged knowing smiles, as if they had already decided she would fail. Every sound felt amplified, every movement around her magnified. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the walls and be invisible once more. She took a deep breath and tried to steady her hands. But they trembled slightly as she approached the piano. The memories from the last days of practice, the quiet evenings spent alone with the instrument, and the flashbacks of childhood lessons all rushed back at once. She remembered the hours she had spent perfecting scales, the notes that had once flowed effortlessly beneath her fingers, and the music that had always felt like an extension of herself. The thought of all those moments colliding with the present made her nervous, almost paralyzed. Her boss appeared nearby, as if sensing her hesitation. He stood with his arms crossed, a faint smirk on his face. He clearly expected her to be ready, to perform on command. His presence made her heart beat faster, and she felt the familiar pressure of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. She took another deep breath, trying to convince herself that she could do this. She had practiced. She remembered the music. She had survived fear before. Yet, the thought of playing in front of everyone still made her want to run. She glanced around the room, seeing her coworkers' faces. Some were smiling politely, others watched with mild curiosity, and a few seemed skeptical. She noticed the way her boss's eyes lingered on her, waiting, almost daring her to back down. That look made her hands tighten into fists for a moment. She knew she had a choice to flee or to face this challenge. But running would not protect her from the memory of the fear she felt. She had to try. As she sat down on the piano bench, the wood cool beneath her fingers, the room seemed to fade away. Her thoughts scattered between fear and determination. She pressed the keys lightly, producing a tentative note. It sounded awkward at first, but it was enough to remind her that she could still make music. She closed her eyes, letting the sound settle in her mind. She could feel the notes vibrating beneath her fingertips, connecting to a part of herself she hadn't felt in years. It was fragile, but it was real. The first few moments were difficult. Her fingers hesitated, uncertain. She stumbled over a simple scale, her confidence wavered, and she felt a wave of panic. She imagined the laughter, the judgment, the whispers behind her back. She wanted to stand up and run, to escape the pressure entirely. But something inside her held fast. She remembered why she had loved music in the first place, how it had given her comfort, strength, and freedom. This performance was not just for her boss or coworkers. It was for herself. She took another deep breath, forcing herself to focus. Slowly, the notes began to flow more naturally. She remembered the melody she had practiced over the past few evenings, and her fingers found their place on the keys. The sound was soft at first, almost shy, but it grew steadily as she became more comfortable. She felt her body relax slightly, her heart rate beginning to settle as she lost herself in the music. The room seemed to change around her. The chatter of coworkers faded, replaced by the simple, pure sound of the piano. As she played, memories from her childhood intertwined with the present. She remembered her first lessons, her first recital. The joy of creating something beautiful from nothing but keys and notes. Those memories gave her courage. The music was no longer something to be forced or controlled by others. It was her own expression, her voice through the piano. The trembling in her hands eased, replaced by a quiet strength. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. She noticed the subtle changes in the room. Her coworkers, who had been skeptical, now listened in silence. Their expressions softened, their attention fully on her. Even her boss, who had been confident and commanding, now watched with something close to disbelief. The music was filling the space with emotion, with honesty, with a story that transcended fear and expectation. It was no longer a performance imposed upon her. It had become an authentic expression of herself. The piece she played was simple, yet it carried the depth of her emotions. Every note told a story of struggle and perseverance, of fear and courage, of the journey she had taken to arrive at this moment. Her fingers moved with increasing confidence, the melodies weaving together seamlessly. She was no longer thinking about the audience or her boss. She was thinking only of the music, of the feeling it evoked, of the freedom it gave her. Time seemed to stretch and bend as she played. Minutes passed without notice, the sound of the piano dominating the room. The tension that had gripped her at the start began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet joy. She realized that she had not only survived the pressure, but had embraced it, transformed it into something beautiful. The music became a bridge between her past and present, connecting the little girl who loved to play with the woman who had been forced to confront fear. When she finally reached the last note, she let her hands linger on the keys. Feeling the vibration, the echo, the resonance of the music, the room remained silent for a moment, as if holding its breath. Then, gradually, a soft murmur of appreciation began to spread. Her coworkers looked at her with new respect, their expressions a mix of surprise and admiration. Even her boss, who had been expecting a performance dictated by his authority, seemed taken aback by the authenticity and emotion of what he had just witnessed. She sat back, her chest heaving slightly from the effort and emotion. Relief and triumph washed over her in equal measure. She had faced the moment she had dreaded, almost walked away from it, yet had found the courage to play. The experience had reminded her of her strength, her talent, and her resilience. It had also reminded her that fear, while powerful, could be transformed into something beautiful when confronted with honesty and courage. As the room gradually returned to normal, the piano once again became an object in the corner, but for her, it remained a symbol of reclaimed power and self-expression. She realized that this moment would stay with her forever, a memory of triumph over fear and the rediscovery of a part of herself she had almost forgotten. The journey had been difficult, the pressure immense, but the reward was more than worth it. She had not only played a piece of music, she had played her own story, and in doing so, she had taken the first true step toward owning her life on her own terms. The moment after her fingers lifted from the final note felt like a suspended heartbeat. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that made her pulse echo in her ears. Her coworkers stared at her, wide-eyed and almost disbelieving. She had expected applause, maybe polite clapping, but what greeted her was something more profound. A silence filled with awe, as if they were all absorbing the depth of what she had just played. Her boss's usual confident demeanor was gone, replaced by something she had never seen before, genuine surprise and perhaps even a hint of humility. She allowed herself a small, private smile. Though her chest still heaved with the intensity of emotion she had poured into the music, her mind replayed the performance. The way each note had flowed, each chord had spoken. She realized she had not simply followed her fingers or the piano. She had let her feelings guide her. The melody had become a vessel for her story, fear, struggle, determination, and rediscovery. The realization brought a warmth to her chest. She had done more than survive this challenge. She had transformed it into something meaningful, something that resonated far beyond herself. Her coworkers started whispering among themselves, unable to contain their surprise. Some exchanged glances, shaking their heads as if to confirm they had just witnessed a remarkable event. Others quietly mouthed words like amazing or beautiful. The change in their demeanor was palpable. She noticed the shift from skepticism to genuine respect. The music had broken through the mundane expectations of the office. Touching something raw and authentic that could not be ignored, her boss cleared his throat, finally breaking the silence. I didn't expect that, he admitted, his voice unusually soft. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of concession. She had anticipated criticism, perhaps even condescending praise, but not this level of acknowledgement. The honesty in his tone caught her off guard. For the first time, she realized that her performance had affected him as well. He was witnessing her not as an employee or a subordinate, but as a person, fully capable of expressing herself through her talent. A coworker stepped forward hesitantly, eyes shining with admiration. "That was incredible," they said. "I never knew you could play like that. You've really got something special." The sincerity of the words made her chest swell with a mix of pride and relief. She had feared judgment, humiliation, and failure, yet here she was, receiving acknowledgement that went beyond polite office decorum. It felt different, real. She began to understand that this experience was not just about music or performance, it was about reclaiming a part of herself that had been hidden away. Waiting for the right moment to surface, her hands still hovered near the keys. Instinctively wanting to play again, though she resisted, she realized the importance of the silence that followed. Every note she had played had already spoken volumes. There was no need to continue. The impact was already made. The room felt charged with energy, a subtle shift in atmosphere that was almost tangible. She had not only challenged herself, but had also changed the perception of those around her. She could feel it in the air, a new dynamic forming. The music had opened a doorway, a glimpse into her inner world that few had ever seen. She sensed that this would alter relationships, even the power dynamics within the office. Her coworkers would no longer see her as merely diligent and quiet. They had witnessed her vulnerability, her courage, and her skill. She had revealed a part of herself she had kept hidden for years, and in doing so, she had earned a level of respect that could not be bought or demanded. It was earned through the purity of expression and the courage to face fear head-on. The rest of the gathering moved on around her, but she remained seated for a few moments longer, absorbing the impact of what had just happened. She noticed subtle gestures of admiration from her colleagues, a nod here, a quiet smile there, conversations that paused as people glanced her way. Even her boss seemed subdued, no longer the imposing figure who had forced her into this situation. The power in the room had shifted, not because of authority, but because of authenticity. She had learned something crucial. True influence came not from command or expectation, but from the ability to express oneself honestly and fairly as people began to approach her, offering compliments and words of encouragement. She felt a warmth spread through her chest. Each acknowledgement reinforced a truth she had long avoided, that she was more than the fears that had held her back. She was capable, talented, and resilient. She had allowed herself to be vulnerable, and that vulnerability had become her strength. The music had been the bridge between her inner world and the outer perception of others, and it had worked beautifully. Her boss finally came closer, his expression more composed than before. "I misjudged you," he admitted quietly. "I didn't realize how much talent you had. You've shown me something I didn't expect." His words were careful, almost reverent. She met his gaze and nodded, acknowledging both the statement and the underlying shift it represented. There was no gloating, no sense of triumph over him. This was about more than proving a point. It was about reclaiming her voice and place in the world. For the first time, she felt a true sense of empowerment. The piano had been her companion, her confidant, her instrument of self-expression, and now it had also become a tool for transformation. She realized that the fear she had carried for so long had been necessary, but it was the courage to confront that fear that had led to growth. The performance had been a test, but more importantly, it had been a revelation. She could see the ripple effect of her performance around the room. Conversations resumed, but they carried a different tone, one of respect, curiosity, and genuine interest. Coworkers approached her with questions about her music, asking how she had learned, what inspired her, and whether she had played in other settings. The questions were not invasive. They were invitations to connect, to acknowledge the person she was beyond the work she performed daily. Each interaction reinforced the sense of self-worth she had rediscovered as the evening wore on. She allowed herself moments of quiet reflection. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from fear and reluctance to courage and expression. She remembered the days when music had been a private sanctuary, the nights of practice alone in her room. The feelings of both joy and frustration that had accompanied every note. Now, those private moments had transformed into a shared experience, a testament to the power of embracing vulnerability and authenticity. The piano, still sitting quietly in the corner, had become a symbol of her journey. It represented the fears she had faced, the talent she had reclaimed, and the courage she had mustered to share herself with the world. She realized that this experience would remain with her, a reference point for future challenges, a reminder that she was capable of more than she had ever allowed herself to believe. By the end of the evening, the gathering had dispersed, leaving her with a quiet sense of accomplishment. She packed her belongings slowly, savoring the lingering energy of the room. She knew that the impact of her performance would not fade quickly. It had altered perceptions, shifted dynamics, and most importantly, transformed her own sense of self. She had faced the fear that had once threatened to overwhelm her, and had emerged not only intact but stronger, more confident, and more connected to her true self than ever before. As she stepped out of the office and into the cool night air, she felt a sense of liberation she hadn't known in years. The city lights flickered, casting reflections on the pavement, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were filled with the music, the faces of her coworkers, the acknowledgement in her boss's eyes, and the quiet triumph she carried within. She understood that this was more than a single performance. It was a turning point, a moment where she had reclaimed her voice, her confidence, and a part of herself that had been waiting to be seen and heard. Walking home, she realized that the journey was not over. There would be new challenges, new fears, and new opportunities to confront herself and the world. But for the first time in a long while, she felt ready. She had faced the pressure, embraced her vulnerability, and transformed it into something meaningful. The music had been her guide, her companion, and her voice, and in its resonance, she had discovered a truth that would remain with her forever, that courage, authenticity, and self-expression could overcome even the heaviest of burdens. The morning after the gathering, she woke up with a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. Her body ached from tension released during the performance, but her mind was alive with a newfound clarity. The events of the previous night replayed vividly in her thoughts, the notes of the piano lingering like echoes in her memory. She remembered the way her fingers had moved across the keys, the look of surprise and admiration in her coworkers' eyes, the subtle shift in her boss's demeanor. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, not just as an employee, but as a person with talent, emotion, and courage. She dressed carefully, choosing her outfit with more thought than usual. There was a quiet confidence in her movements, a sense of purpose that had been absent for a long time. Even though she had faced fear head-on, she knew that the journey wasn't over. The office would return to its usual rhythm. The pressures and expectations would continue, and she would have to navigate the delicate balance of work and personal expression. But she felt different, lighter, stronger, more in control of her own path. When she arrived at the office, the atmosphere was noticeably changed. Her coworkers greeted her with smiles, some approaching with questions about the piano. Was curious about her experience and the music she had played. Their tone was sincere, and she could feel the respect they had for her growing. The previous skepticism and doubt had transformed into admiration and interest. Even the office chatter seemed different, more relaxed, more genuine. It was as if the performance had created a ripple effect, reminding everyone that there was more to the people around them than the roles they played at work. Her boss appeared shortly after, his usual commanding presence tempered by a quiet acknowledgement. He approached her with a measured step, his expression calm but reflective. "I've been thinking about what you played yesterday," he said. "It wasn't just skill. It was emotion, expression, something I didn't expect to see here." She nodded, appreciating the honesty in his words. She could see that he had been affected, that her music had shifted something within him. Yet, she also realized that this moment was about more than validation from others. It was about reclaiming herself, her talent, and the courage to face challenges on her own terms. Throughout the day, small moments reminded her of the change. A coworker paused to ask if she would play again sometime. Another commented on how moving the performance had been. She smiled, realizing that the piano had become more than just an instrument. It had become a bridge between her inner world and those around her. It had allowed her to share a part of herself that had been hidden for years, and in doing so, she had not only connected with others but also with herself. Despite the positive reactions, she knew there was a decision to be made. The performance had opened doors, but it had also made her aware of the limitations and expectations she had endured at the office. She realized that true freedom and growth would not come from staying in a place where she felt constrained, even if it was familiar and secure. The experience had shown her her own strength and potential, and she could no longer ignore the possibility of pursuing a path that aligned with her passions and abilities. That evening, she sat quietly in her small apartment, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. She thought about the fear she had felt, the hesitation to play, the moment she almost walked away. She remembered the music that had guided her, the emotions that had poured through her fingers, and the faces of those who had witnessed her expression. Each memory reinforced the realization that she was capable of more than she had allowed herself to believe. She began to consider her future, the possibilities that had once seemed distant or impossible. The piano had reminded her of the joy and fulfillment that could come from following her passions. From embracing her talents without fear, she realized that staying in the office, while safe and predictable, would limit her potential. The experience had given her clarity. She could no longer ignore the calling within her. The next morning, she made a choice. She approached her boss, who was busy at his desk, and asked to speak privately. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from anticipation of taking control of her life. She explained that while she appreciated the opportunity and the experience, she had decided to pursue a path that allowed her to embrace her talents fully and grow in ways the office could not offer. Her boss listened, his expression unreadable at first, then softened. There was no anger, only a quiet acknowledgement of her decision. As she packed her belongings and prepared to leave, she felt a sense of liberation, unlike anything she had experienced before. She was leaving behind the constraints and expectations that had once defined her daily life, stepping into a future filled with possibility, creativity, and self-determination. The piano had been the catalyst, the bridge that allowed her to reconnect with herself and recognize the power she had always carried. Walking out of the office for the last time, she breathed in deeply, savoring the freedom and clarity that came with her choice. The city outside seemed brighter, the air lighter, as if reflecting the change within her. She felt ready to face the world on her own terms, guided by the music, courage, and self-belief that had been reignited by the journey she had undertaken. In the weeks and months that followed, she continued to play, to explore her talents, and to embrace opportunities that aligned with her passions. She found joy in teaching others, performing in new settings, and reconnecting with the music that had always been a part of her soul. Each day reinforced the lesson she had learned, that fear, when faced with courage and honesty, could be transformed into a force for growth, self-discovery, and empowerment. Her journey had begun with fear and hesitation, had moved through pressure and doubt, and had culminated in triumph and clarity. The piano had been both a challenge and a sanctuary, a teacher and a companion. And through it all, she had discovered the most important truth, that embracing oneself fully, with all strengths, talents, and vulnerabilities, was the greatest act of courage and the key to a life truly worth living.